The village of Saint-Pierre had once been a quiet corner of Normandy, where bells rang from the chapel tower every morning, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from stone houses clustered along narrow lanes. Now, silence weighed heavy on the air. The chapel lay broken, its steeple torn apart by bombs, its walls blackened with smoke. Piles of rubble filled the square, where children used to chase one another in games of laughter. Only the wind moved freely, whistling through empty windows and hollow ruins. The smell of dust clung stubbornly to the ground. Smoke still lingered in corners of shattered barns and collapsed roofs, blending with the faint, bitter trace of gunpowder. Where once voices had filled the streets, there remained only whispers and the muffled shuffle of tired feet. For the elders of Saint-Pierre, this was not just destruction of stone, but a wound carved deep into the heart of their lives. Among them was Jacques Moreau, a 72-year-old schoolteacher who had taught generations of the village's children. His shoulders were bent with age, but his gaze carried the stubborn fire of someone who refused to surrender to despair. Each morning, he walked to the ruins of the chapel. Standing before the fallen stones, he remembered baptisms, weddings, and funerals that had taken place inside. For Jacques, the chapel was not simply a building. It was the village's soul. As he leaned on his walking stick, Jacques spoke quietly, almost as if the stones could hear him. "You held us together through centuries of storms, and now you lie silent." His words trembled, part prayer, part lament. If you are listening to this story and want to follow more tales of courage and humanity like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing these moving stories to life. The weight of loss pressed heavily on Jacques, yet he was not alone in his grief. Around him, the other elders stood silently, staring at the chapel's remains. Some crossed themselves, others simply lowered their heads. To them, the war had stolen not only lives and homes, but also the place where they had once found strength to endure hardships. Without the chapel, Saint-Pierre felt unmoored, its identity fractured. The younger villagers, hardened by fear and scarcity, carried baskets of meager bread or patched clothing, hurrying about their survival. To them, rebuilding seemed a dream too distant to grasp. But for Jacques, the sight of the ruined chapel pierced deeper than hunger. It was as though his memories had been stripped of their shelter. Rumors passed through the streets in hushed tones. Whispers of German patrols roaming the countryside, of villages punished for defiance, of strangers arriving along the coast. Yet through all the uncertainty, one truth remained. Saint-Pierre was broken and its heart lay in ruins. That morning, Jacques paused at the cracked doorway where the chapel's great oak door had once stood. A child tugged at his sleeve, a girl no older than 7, clutching a piece of stale bread. "Monsieur Moreau," she asked timidly, "will the bell ever ring again?" His throat tightened. He crouched to meet her eyes, placing a trembling hand on her shoulder. "One day, little one, one day it will ring and we will gather again. Until then, we must not forget what it sounded like." Her innocent question echoed in his mind long after she skipped away. The truth was bitter. Without help, the chapel could not be rebuilt. The village had no tools, no supplies, and little strength left. And yet, Jacques' heart clung to the hope that something or someone might restore what had been lost. Evening came, and the last light of the sun cast golden streaks over the rubble, as if reminding the villagers that beauty could survive even amid ruin. Jacques remained there until the shadows lengthened. Then, in the stillness of dusk, a sound broke the silence. Distant engines rolling closer, heavy with authority. The villagers froze. Some ran indoors, others peered anxiously from doorways. Jacques, standing at the chapel ruins, lifted his eyes toward the horizon. He saw the dust rising, heard the steady rhythm of approaching vehicles. Soldiers, strangers were coming into Saint-Pierre. Whether they would bring more destruction or perhaps a glimmer of hope, no one yet knew. But Jacques felt the air shift around him. The story of Saint-Pierre was about to change. The sound of engines grew louder, echoing through the narrow streets of Saint-Pierre. Villagers gathered in silence, their eyes fixed on the column of vehicles that rolled into the square. Dust rose behind them, settling on broken stones and the charred remains of homes. The insignia on the trucks and jeeps was unmistakable. American troops had arrived. Jacques Moreau stood at the edge of the square, leaning on his walking stick, his heart divided between suspicion and cautious hope. The villagers whispered nervously. For years they had endured the iron grip of occupation, where every stranger could mean betrayal and every uniform a threat. Now, these men in unfamiliar green uniforms filled the air with a different kind of tension. Captain Robert Miller stepped out of a jeep, his tall figure framed by the afternoon light. His uniform was dusty, his face tired, yet his eyes carried a spark of determination. He scanned the square, noting the wary expressions of the villagers. Behind him, soldiers unloaded supplies, their voices a mix of English words the French could barely understand. One of the villagers muttered, "Another army, another set of masters." The words hung in the air like a shadow. Private Anthony Romano, short and broad-shouldered, noticed the cold stares directed at them. Adjusting his helmet, he whispered to the soldier beside him, "They look at us like we're invaders, not liberators." His accent carried the rough edges of New York, but his tone held something softer, a desire to be understood. Captain Miller approached the villagers, raising his hand in greeting. "We come in peace," he said, his voice calm though uncertain if anyone would comprehend. A few villagers exchanged glances, unable to grasp his words. Only Sister Claire, who had once studied in Paris and understood some English, stepped forward. Her black habit was dusty from tending to the wounded, but her posture was firm. "You are Americans?" she asked in halting English. "Yes, ma'am," Miller replied with relief. "We're here to push the Germans back. Your village is safe now." "Safe?" The word sounded fragile in the ruined square. A murmur ran through the crowd, some sighing in relief, others narrowing their eyes in doubt. Jacques stepped forward, speaking in French, his voice steady though his heart raced. "They bring words of peace. But what do words mean in a place like this?" Sister Claire translated, her voice carrying both his skepticism and his longing for truth. Captain Miller listened carefully, then answered, "We don't just bring words, we bring protection, and whatever help we can offer." Romano, eager to soften the tension, tried a few broken French phrases he had picked up. Pain, eau, amis, bread, water, friends. His pronunciation was clumsy, but his effort drew nervous laughter from a few children hiding behind their mothers. Jacques observed closely. He saw exhaustion in the Americans' faces, but also something genuine. Small gestures of respect, the way they lowered their voices near the elders, the way they handed out a little chocolate to the children. These were not looters, nor men drunk on power. Yet trust did not come easily. "Do not be quick to embrace them," murmured Henri Duval, the village's mayor, who stood near Jacques. His expression was stern. "Every foreign army comes with promises, and promises can be broken." Jacques did not reply, but his eyes lingered on Captain Miller, who was kneeling to speak gently with a boy holding a wooden toy soldier. The boy's eyes, once dulled by fear, lit with a flicker of curiosity. Evening shadows stretched across the square as the Americans set up camp outside the village. Fires glowed faintly, the smell of rations mingling with the earth. Villagers shut their doors, some whispering prayers, others whispering suspicions. Yet Jacques remained by the ruins of the chapel, his gaze drifting between the broken stones and the strangers who had come. Something within him stirred, a question he dared not yet voice. Could these foreigners bring more than soldiers' strength? Could they perhaps carry the spark of something the village had nearly lost? Days passed after the Americans' arrival, and though the sound of gunfire had faded into the distance, another battle pressed upon the people of Saint-Pierre, the battle against hunger. The fields lay untended, livestock had been stolen or slaughtered during the long occupation, and the few sacks of grain hidden away were nearly empty. Bread was stretched thin, each loaf divided with painful precision. Jacques watched as women stood in the square, trading scraps of cheese or dried beans as if they were treasures. Children gnawed on hard crusts, their cheeks hollowing under the weight of months without nourishment. Pride held the villagers together, yet pride could not fill their stomachs. The Americans, well supplied compared to the French, began distributing rations. Cans of meat, powdered milk, chocolate, and coffee appeared in careful portions. Soldiers smiled as they handed food to children, but the adults hesitated. Accepting aid felt like admitting defeat, as though centuries of resilience had been reduced to begging. One afternoon, Jacques observed a quiet standoff. A soldier extended a tin of meat to Madame Lefebvre, a widow known for her stubborn dignity. She crossed her arms, shaking her head. "Non, merci. My family has survived worse. We do not take handouts." Private Romano, who had been the one offering, tilted his head and replied in broken French, "It is gift, amis." His eyes pleaded more than his words. But Madame Lefebvre turned away, her lips pressed tight. Jacques stepped forward, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. Pride has carried us far, but pride cannot feed the little ones. Take it for them. His voice cracked with both authority and compassion. After a long pause, she accepted, though her eyes filled with shame. That evening, the tension spread through the village like a fire. Some argued they should embrace the Americans' help, while others warned that such dependence could invite punishment from the Germans, who were known to strike villages suspected of collaborating. Fear and hunger warred with one another, leaving hearts divided. In the candle-lit silence of his home, Jacques wrestled with his own conscience. His pride as a teacher, as a man who had endured occupation without bowing, weighed heavily. Yet he could not ignore the trembling hands of children reaching for crumbs. He whispered to himself, "What dignity is left if our children starve?" The next morning, Jacques approached Captain Miller near the soldiers' camp. Miller was inspecting supplies, his brow furrowed with concern. "Your people do not trust us?" he said, glancing toward the village. Jacques nodded. "They have lived too long under boots that claim to protect. They fear your gifts may come with hidden chains." Miller sighed, his voice low. "We came to fight an enemy, not to burden friends, but I understand. Trust doesn't come overnight." Romano, standing nearby, leaned closer to Jacques. "Monsieur, when I give chocolate to a child, I don't think about politics. I think about my little sister back home. I just want them to smile." Jacques studied him carefully, sensing sincerity in his rough accent and tired eyes. Perhaps not all gestures were political. Some came simply from the heart. By midday, more villagers had gathered in the square, watching silently as the Americans unloaded rations. Jacques stood among them, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "We must remember, accepting kindness does not erase our strength. It does not make us weak, it makes us human." His words rippled through the crowd, loosening some of the resistance. One by one, elders approached the soldiers, taking small portions with hesitant gratitude. The children, less bound by pride, reached eagerly, their laughter breaking through the gloom. Yet not all hearts softened. Henri Duval, the mayor, stood at the edge, his jaw tight. "This path is dangerous," he muttered to Jacques. "The Germans punish villages for less. Do not mistake charity for safety." Jacques met his eyes, feeling the weight of the warning. Hunger had been eased for a moment, but danger lingered in the shadows of the forest. Trust in the Americans could nourish their bodies, yet it might also place their lives in peril. That night Jacques lay awake, listening to the faint sounds of soldiers outside and the restless silence within the village. Between hunger and pride, between fear and hope, Saint-Pierre walked a fragile line, and Jacques knew that the days ahead would test more than their stomachs. They would test their very souls. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth after a night of rain. Jacques Moreau stood once more before the ruins of the chapel. The fallen stones glistened with dew, as if weeping silently for all they had endured. He leaned on his cane and let his hand rest on one of the cracked walls, his fingers tracing the grooves carved centuries before. Memories rose like ghosts, not of war, but of life. He recalled the joy of bells ringing on a wedding morning, when the entire village gathered to watch a bride step through those doors in a gown carefully sewn by her mother. He remembered baptisms, infants wrapped in white cloth as proud fathers stood tall, and funerals where the chapel had cradled grief with solemn dignity. The building had been more than stone. It had been the vessel of Saint-Pierre's spirit. Now the silence pressed on him. Without the chapel, the village seemed like a body without a heart. Jacques closed his eyes and whispered, "We are adrift. Without these walls, our faith has no shelter." His voice broke in the stillness, and he pressed his palm more firmly against the cold stone, as if clinging to it might keep the past alive. Around him, a few elders joined in quiet reflection. Madame Lefebvre murmured, "I married here when the bell rang brighter than the sun. Now my grandchildren will never know that sound." Her words carried both sorrow and resignation. The younger villagers, however, walked past with indifference. To them, survival mattered more than memories. A boy carrying a basket of firewood muttered, "Stone cannot feed us nor keep us warm." His tone stung Jacques, though he could not deny the truth behind it. War had hardened the young, stripping them of the patience to honor traditions. Sister Claire arrived, her arms full of herbs gathered for the wounded. She paused by Jacques and said softly, "The chapel was not only for prayer, it was where we remembered who we were. Even the children who now scorn it will feel its absence one day." Jacques nodded, grateful for her words. Yet he felt the weight of doubt pressing harder. Was it selfish to cling to a dream of rebuilding when food was scarce, when safety was fragile? The villagers needed hope, but could stone and mortar truly provide it? Across the square, Captain Miller observed quietly, his hands clasped behind his back. He had grown accustomed to ruined villages, but there was something about the way these people gazed at their chapel that unsettled him. Later, he confided to Romano, "This place means more to them than any monument back home. It's not just a building, it's their anchor." Romano scratched his chin, replying, "Yeah, but are we supposed to rebuild churches now? We got a war to fight." Miller's expression tightened. "Exactly. I can't order men to spend time on something outside our mission, but I wonder if there's more we can do than just hand out rations." Though Miller's thoughts remained unspoken to the villagers, Jacques sensed a shift in the way the soldiers lingered near the ruins. They did not mock or dismiss it. They looked at it with respect, even curiosity. Small gestures, a soldier removing his helmet as he passed, another pausing to peer at the altar stone, did not go unnoticed. That night, as Jacques sat by the dim glow of a lantern, he scribbled in his worn notebook. His handwriting trembled, but his words flowed. "If the stones rise again, perhaps we too will rise. If the bell sings once more, perhaps our souls will remember their strength." Closing the notebook, he felt the weight of uncertainty. Rebuilding seemed impossible, yet the vision would not leave him. He could not silence the hope that clung stubbornly to his heart, even as the world around him tried to crush it. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, the image of the chapel, whole and alive, shimmered in his mind, pulling him toward a path he had not yet dared to walk. The days settled into a fragile rhythm, villagers scavenging for food, soldiers keeping watch, and the ruins of the chapel looming in silence over the square. It was Private Anthony Romano who first broke that stillness with an idea that seemed almost foolish. One evening, as the soldiers rested after patrol, Romano squatted near the rubble, running his hand over the broken stones. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "we could at least clear some of this. Doesn't take a miracle, just a few strong backs." A fellow soldier laughed. "You volunteering us for construction duty, Tony?" Romano shrugged, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "Better than sitting on our gear waiting for orders. Besides, maybe it means something to them." The next morning, when Captain Miller noticed a few soldiers shifting rubble at the chapel site, he raised a brow. "What's going on here?" Romano straightened, brushing dust from his hands. "Just helping out, sir. These people stare at the ruins like it's a corpse in the middle of the village. Figured we could start cleaning, make it less of a graveyard." Miller hesitated, glancing toward Jacques Moreau, who stood nearby watching with narrowed eyes. The old teacher's heart leapt at the sight of foreigners lifting stones, yet suspicion weighed heavily. To touch the chapel's remains was to step into sacred ground. He approached slowly, his cane tapping against the stones. "This place is not just rubble," Jacques said in French, his voice stern. "It carries centuries of our lives. These stones are part of us." Romano, though not fully understanding, caught the sharpness in his tone. "Respect," he said in halting French, pressing a hand to his chest. "We respect." Sister Claire translated more clearly, her calm voice bridging the gap. "They do not mean harm, Jacques. Perhaps their strength could serve what remains." Still, some villagers recoiled at the sight. Madame Lefebvre shook her head. "Foreign hands have no place on holy stone. What if they desecrate what is left?" Others muttered agreement, their voices tight with fear, but the children saw differently. Young boys and girls crept closer, wide-eyed as soldiers lifted heavy blocks with ease. A boy whispered, "They move stones like giants." By midday, curiosity overcame hesitation. A few villagers, inspired by the soldiers' sweat, joined in. Old Pierre, a farmer with calloused hands, rolled up his sleeves. "If strangers care for our chapel, how can we stand idle?" he said, setting his shoulder against a slab. The rhythm of labor began, shovels scraping, grunts of effort, the dull thud of stones stacked aside. Dust filled the air, coating skin and clothes, yet a strange energy stirred in the square. For the first time in months, the village was not simply surviving, it was working toward something. Captain Miller observed from the edge, torn between duty and conscience. His orders did not mention rebuilding chapels, but he could not deny the sight before him. Men who had carried rifles that morning now carried beams, their faces lit with a different kind of determination. Jacques, though still wary, felt his chest tighten with something he had nearly forgotten. Hope. He turned to Sister Claire. Do you see how they look at the stones? Not as conquerors, but as men who wish to mend. Perhaps God sends help in uniforms we did not expect. Yet not all hearts softened. Mayor Henri Duval appeared, his voice sharp. This is folly. Let them fight their war and leave our sacred ground untouched. If the Germans learn we are working with these men, we will pay dearly. His words carried weight, and murmurs of fear spread through the crowd. But Jacques stood tall, his cane firm against the earth. Our faith has already been punished. If we do nothing, the chapel remains a tomb. If we try, perhaps it becomes a home again. His defiance silenced the square. Even Duval could not dismiss the conviction in the old man's voice. As the sun sank behind the hills, the first pile of cleared stones marked the beginning of something new. Dust clung to hair and hands, but there were smiles among the weary. For the first time since the bells had fallen silent, Saint-Pierre had taken its first step toward reclaiming its soul. The work at the chapel site grew each day, but so did the confusion. Soldiers and villagers moved side by side, sweat dripping under the summer sun, yet their words rarely reached across the gap of language. Commands in English went unanswered. Questions in French drew blank stares. The labor itself became a strange dance of gestures, pointing, miming, nodding, shaking heads, awkward, yet determined. One afternoon, Romano attempted to explain how to lift a heavy beam safely. He waved his arms, grunted, and bent his knees dramatically. The French farmers watched him with puzzled expressions. Old Pierre muttered, "Does he mean to dance with the wood?" The men chuckled, and Romano, hearing their laughter, joined in with a wide grin. The humor broke the tension, even if the message was lost. Jacques, watching from a distance, decided to bridge the gap. He stepped forward and, in his shaky English, said, "Bend, knees ain't together." His accent was thick, the words halting, but Romano's eyes lit with recognition. "Yes, together," he shouted, clapping Jacques on the back. For the first time, Jacques felt the barrier between them shift, if only slightly. That evening, Jacques sat with a notebook, scribbling English phrases alongside their French meanings. Romano, curious, joined him by the lantern's glow. "How you say stone?" he asked. Jacques answered, "Pierre." Romano repeated clumsily, "Pierre." Jacques chuckled, correcting him with patient precision. In return, Romano taught him simple words: friend, strong, hope. Their voices stumbled over pronunciation, but each laugh and correction drew them closer. Children soon followed, fascinated by the exchange. A little girl pointed to her doll and asked, "How do you say poupée?" Romano replied proudly, "Doll," then repeated, until the children shouted the word in chorus. Their laughter echoed across the square, a sound brighter than the clang of hammers. Yet not all exchanges were light-hearted. Misunderstandings caused tempers to flare. One day, a soldier handed a hammer to Madame Lefebvre with an encouraging smile, but she interpreted the gesture as impatience, believing he thought her too slow. "I will not be treated like a child," she snapped in French, slamming the hammer to the ground. The soldier looked bewildered, stammering apologies in English she could not grasp. It took Sister Claire's calm mediation to smooth the moment. Despite these frictions, the shared labor wove unseen threads between the two groups. They began to anticipate one another's movements, to read gestures with greater ease, to sense intent behind words they could not understand. Sweat and effort spoke a language older than any dialect. At night, stories began to pass between them in fragments. A soldier pointed to a photo of his wife tucked in his helmet, murmuring home, and the villagers nodded, whispering maison. Jacques shared tales of village festivals, drawing pictures in the dirt to illustrate dances and songs. The soldiers listened with curiosity, piecing together meaning through tone and expression. Captain Miller, who often observed quietly, noted the subtle transformation. "It's not the words that matter," he said to Sister Claire. "It's the intent. They're finding ways to understand each other without us." Claire smiled faintly. Perhaps language was never the truest barrier. It is trust that must be learned. The chapel walls, though still only a skeleton of rubble and timber, seemed to rise faster now. Each lifted stone carried more than weight. It carried the effort of strangers learning to act as neighbors. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in hues of red and gold, Jacques stood with Romano at the edge of the square. Jacques struggled with the English word, testing it carefully on his tongue. "Hope." Romano grinned, repeating it back in French. "Espoir." They laughed together, the sound ringing clear as a bell, as if somewhere deep within the ruins the chapel itself approved of their new unspoken language. The progress on the chapel brought light to the village, yet beyond the hills, the darkness of war still lingered. The Germans had not vanished. They had only retreated deeper into the countryside, leaving patrols to haunt the forests like wolves circling a wounded flock. Every rumor spread fear, tales of villages burned, of reprisals for the smallest act of defiance. One evening, as Jacques made his way home, he overheard two men speaking in hushed tones near the well. "They say a German unit was spotted near Caumont," one whispered. "If they find out we're working with the Americans, they'll punish us all." Jacques felt the chill of those words settle into his bones. He had lived through too many years of occupation to dismiss such fears. Every stone lifted at the chapel seemed to carry not only hope, but also the weight of risk. The next day, tension flared openly in the square. Henri Duval, the mayor, stood with arms crossed, his voice sharp as he confronted Jacques. "Do you not see the danger? If the enemy returns and sees what we are doing, we will suffer their wrath. You lead us into peril, old man." Jacques steadied his cane, his eyes narrowing. "And if we do nothing? If we let our chapel rot in the dust? Then the war has already stolen our soul." Their argument drew a crowd. Villagers divided between fear and longing. Madame Lefebvre murmured, "He may be right, Henri. The chapel is our heart. Without it, who are we?" Others shook their heads, whispering of fire and guns. Captain Miller, watching from the edge, stepped forward. Though he understood only fragments of their French, the tone of fear was unmistakable. He spoke slowly through Sister Claire's translations. "We will protect this village. That is our duty, but I cannot promise the war will not touch you again." The villagers fell silent. Protection sounded comforting, but Miller's honesty stripped the illusion of safety bare. He was a soldier, not a savior. That night, Jacques sat by his window, the candlelight flickering against his lined face. He thought of the little girl who had once asked if the bell would ring again. Was he leading her into danger with his stubborn hope? The burden pressed heavily on his chest, yet deep inside a voice refused to yield. If we surrender even our faith, then the war has already won. Meanwhile, the soldiers themselves felt the shadow creeping closer. Romano confessed to Miller as they shared a late meal, "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing, sir. What if the Krauts come back and these people suffer for it?" Miller's jaw tightened. "Every choice in this war carries risk, Romano. But if rebuilding a chapel gives them strength to endure, then maybe it's worth the danger." The next morning, as villagers and soldiers resumed their work, Jacques noticed how the sound of every bird call made some heads turn sharply, as if expecting footsteps in the woods. Even the children played more quietly, sensing the adults' unease. Still, the work continued. Stones rose slowly into walls, timber was shaped into beams, and the skeleton of the chapel began to take form. Each hammer strike was both defiance and prayer, a rhythm against despair. At dusk, Jacques stood beside Romano, gazing toward the forest that loomed beyond the fields. "Do you hear it?" Jacques asked softly. "Hear what?" Romano replied. "The silence. It is not peace. It is waiting." Romano frowned, gripping the strap of his rifle. "Then we'll be ready when it breaks." Jacques nodded, though his heart trembled. The chapel was rising, yes, but so too was the threat that shadows might soon fall upon them again. The chapel site no longer stood as a silent ruin, but as a hive of activity. The clatter of hammers, the scrape of shovels, and the groan of heavy beams filled the square each day. Villagers and soldiers worked side by side, their breaths mingling in the warm summer air. The sun baked their backs, and dust coated their skin until they looked almost alike, stripped of rank or status, united in sweat. Jacques Moreau moved slowly among them, offering what strength he could with his frail hands, but his voice carried authority. He directed younger men where to place stones, reminding them of the chapel's original shape. The soldiers listened, nodding with respect, as if acknowledging him as a master builder rather than just an old teacher. For Jacques, it was a strange and humbling reversal, foreign soldiers giving weight to his guidance. Romano became a familiar presence among the villagers, his laughter cutting through weariness. He teased children as he carried timber on his shoulders, and they followed him as if he were a friendly giant. "Stronger than 2 oxen," one boy declared, and Romano grinned, flexing his arms with mock bravado. The villagers chuckled, and for a brief moment the shadow of war loosened its grip. Still, challenges loomed. Tools were scarce, and every nail or plank had to be scavenged or repurposed. When a beam cracked under pressure, frustration rippled through the workers. Madame Lefebvre sighed heavily. "We try, but with nothing in our hands, how far can we go?" Romano crouched by the broken beam, running a hand over its splintered edge. "We'll fix it," he said simply, though his French faltered. His certainty carried more weight than the words themselves. And true enough, by evening soldiers had fashioned braces from salvaged wood, proving again that determination could replace what supplies lacked. In these small victories, bonds grew. Meals were shared more freely, slices of bread traded for spoonfuls of stew, American coffee poured into chipped French mugs. Around the fire at night, stories flowed in fragments. Soldiers spoke of farms in Kansas, streets in New York, sisters and sweethearts waiting back home. Villagers shared tales of harvest festivals and winter markets, voices soft with nostalgia. Though words stumbled, gestures and laughter filled the gaps. One evening, Jacques found himself seated beside Captain Miller, both men silent at first, staring at the rising frame of the chapel. Miller broke the silence. "You remind me of my father," he admitted quietly. "He was stubborn too, believed some things should never be left broken." Jacques turned to him, eyes narrowing with curiosity. "And you? Do you believe the same?" Miller hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but I wonder if rebuilding here is my place." Jacques tapped his cane against the earth. "Sometimes it is not a question of place, Captain. It is a question of courage. You have given us yours, whether you meant to or not." The words hung between them, heavy yet reassuring. Miller's gaze softened, and for once the burden on his shoulders seemed to lighten. But not all moments were tender. Tensions flared when a soldier accidentally dropped a stone that shattered part of a wall already laid. Voices rose in anger, villagers accusing carelessness, soldiers defending fatigue. Jacques stepped forward, raising his cane. "Enough! Stones can be replaced. Trust cannot. If we lose that, we lose everything." His voice, firm and resonant, silenced the quarrel. The next day, the work resumed with renewed determination, each man and woman more mindful of the fragile unity being built along with the chapel walls. By dusk, the structure had grown noticeably. Shadows stretched across the square, falling over villagers and soldiers alike as they wiped sweat from their brows. Jacques looked upon their weary faces and felt a surge of pride. For the first time in years, Saint-Pierre was not merely surviving. It was creating, rebuilding, daring to believe again. Yet, as he gazed toward the forest beyond, Jacques knew the war had not forgotten them. The bonds forged in sweat and trust would soon be tested, perhaps more harshly than any of them expected. The chapel walls had begun to rise again, rough but proud, like a skeleton reclaiming its flesh. Each day, more villagers joined the effort, drawn by the sight of strangers laboring for something that belonged to them. Yet the growing momentum also stirred resentment, and it was Henri Duval, the mayor, who finally brought it to a boil. One afternoon, as workers hauled beams into place, Duval strode into the square, his black coat buttoned tight despite the heat. His voice cut across the air with the authority of office. "Stop this madness," he shouted in French, his finger stabbing toward the half-built chapel. "You endanger us all with this foolishness." The villagers froze, hammers and shovels hanging mid-air. Jacques Moreau stepped forward, leaning on his cane but standing as tall as his frail body allowed. "You call it madness, Henri, but I call it life. Each stone we lift is a breath for Saint-Pierre." Duval's eyes flashed with anger. "You think the Germans will ignore this? You think they will not punish us for working with the Americans? This chapel will be our grave if you continue." Murmurs spread through the crowd, fear tightening their faces. Some nodded at Duval's warning, others glanced at Jacques, searching for reassurance. Captain Miller, sensing the tension though unable to grasp every word, asked Sister Claire to translate. When he understood, his jaw hardened. "We don't force anyone to build, they choose. But let them choose without fear." Duval swung his gaze toward Miller. "And when you leave, Captain, when your war moves elsewhere, who will protect us then? Who will shield our children from reprisal?" The words struck deep. Even Jacques felt the sting of their truth. The Americans would not stay forever. The villagers would be left with the consequences of whatever they did now. Silence pressed heavy until Jacques' voice rose, firm and unwavering. "Henri, we have lived in fear too long. Fear of the Germans, fear of hunger, fear of tomorrow. If we let fear decide everything, then we are already defeated. This chapel is not just stone, it is our defiance. Without it, we remain broken. The villagers stirred, torn between Duval's caution and Jacques' conviction. Madame Lefebvre whispered, "Perhaps the old man is right. What life do we have if we abandon all hope?" Others muttered doubts, their voices trembling. Romano, sensing the villagers' unease, spoke in halting French, his words clumsy but heartfelt. "We help because we believe, not army order, heart order." He placed a hand on his chest, his expression earnest. Laughter rippled faintly at his broken phrasing, but the sincerity behind it silenced mockery. Duval scowled. "You let sentiment blind you. Rebuilding now is arrogance. The war has not ended. You gamble with lives for the sake of pride." Jacques stepped closer, his cane tapping against the stones, his eyes locked on the mayor's. "And you gamble with our souls by doing nothing. If we wait for safety, we will wait until we are dust. The chapel is our strength, and without strength, how will we survive at all?" The clash of voices hung over the square like a storm. Villagers shifted uneasily, their loyalty divided. Finally, Sister Claire raised her voice, calm but commanding. "Enough. This is not a quarrel of enemies. Both fear and hope live here. But each of you must decide which will lead you." Her words settled over them, leaving the villagers to wrestle with their own hearts. By dusk, work resumed, though slower, with hesitation woven into every movement. Some sided with Jacques, pressing on despite fear. Others lingered at the edges, unwilling to risk open defiance of Duval. The chapel continued to rise, but so did the fracture within the village. As night fell, Jacques sat alone by the unfinished wall, the weight of Duval's words heavy on his chest. He knew the mayor's warning carried truth, yet when he placed his hand against the stone, he also knew his choice was made. Better to face danger with dignity than to live forever in fear. The summer sky burned with a restless heat, and the air hung heavy as though it carried warning. Work at the chapel continued with determination, villagers and soldiers moving in rhythm despite the doubts that lingered after Duval's protests. Hope flickered in every lifted stone, but fate had its own test to deliver. Late one afternoon, as beams were hoisted into place, a low hum filled the air. At first it blended with the labor's noise, but soon it grew sharper, angrier, the unmistakable drone of planes overhead. Heads snapped upward. Someone cried out, "Bombers!" Panic swept through the square. Mothers pulled children close, men shouted for cover. The Americans barked orders, ushering villagers towards cellars and ditches. Then the whistling began, shrill and merciless as bombs fell in the distance. The earth shook, dust raining down from broken rooftops. One explosion landed closer, and part of the chapel wall crumbled, collapsing in a storm of stone and mortar. When the dust settled, groans filled the air. Among the injured was Pierre, the farmer who had worked tirelessly since the first stone was lifted. He lay pinned beneath a fallen beam, his face pale, breath ragged. Villagers rushed to help, but the weight was crushing. Romano and two soldiers heaved with desperate strength, their muscles straining until the beam rolled free. Jacques knelt beside Pierre, gripping his calloused hand. "Hold on, mon ami, you are stronger than this." But Pierre's eyes flickered with pain and despair. "All for nothing," he whispered. "We rebuild and the sky tears it down again." His words spread like poison through the crowd. Murmurs rose, that Duval had been right, that their efforts were futile, that hope was too fragile against the weight of war. Fear tightened its grip, and the villagers looked to Jacques, their faith teetering on the edge. Jacques felt the crushing burden of their stares. His heart pounded with doubt, yet he forced himself to rise, leaning on his cane as if drawing strength from the earth itself. His voice rang out, trembling but resolute. "Look around you. Yes, a wall has fallen. Yes, a friend has been hurt. But does that mean we stop breathing? Stop living? If we let fear decide, then we may as well lie down in the rubble and wait for death." The villagers stilled, listening, their eyes wide. Jacques lifted his chin, his frail body trembling with the weight of conviction. "This chapel is not just stone. It is us. If it falls 100 times, then 100 times we will raise it again. Not because it is easy, not because it is safe, but because it is who we are." Silence followed, broken only by Pierre's labored breathing. Then Madame Lefebvre stepped forward, placing her hand on Jacques' arm. "He is right. If we abandon this, we abandon ourselves." Others murmured agreement, and slowly the fear that had coiled in their chests began to loosen. Romano, still covered in dust, raised his voice. We rebuild, always rebuild. His words, broken but forceful, echoed Jacques' resolve. Captain Miller surveyed the scene, his expression grim yet proud. He knew the risks, knew the fragility of their work, but he also recognized the fire that had been rekindled. Quietly he said to Claire, "They will not be broken. Not now." That evening, as the injured were tended and the rubble cleared once more, the villagers returned to the work with renewed determination. The ruined wall was not a defeat, but a challenge, and each stone lifted in the fading light became a declaration. They would not surrender their spirit. Jacques stood near the altar stone, his heart weary yet burning. Pierre's words still haunted him, but the villagers' response had given them meaning. Out of destruction they had chosen defiance, and Jacques knew, deep in his soul, that the chapel would rise, not because it was protected, but because they refused to let it die. The chapel, though still a skeleton of stone and timber, had become more than a construction site. By night, when the tools were set aside and the village square grew quiet, people gathered inside its half-formed walls. The flicker of candles cast warm light across rough stones, softening the ruin into something almost sacred. On one such evening, Jacques Moreau found himself surrounded by faces that carried both weariness and a fragile glow of hope. Villagers sat shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, the air thick with the smell of sweat, wood smoke, and wax. For the first time in years, silence did not feel like emptiness. It felt like anticipation. Romano broke it with laughter as he held out a bar of chocolate, breaking it into pieces and handing it to the children. "From America," he said proudly. The little ones repeated the word in their French accents, giggling as they savored the rare sweetness. Their joy spread quickly, easing the heavy mood. Soon, the villagers began to share their own comforts. Madame Lefebvre produced a flask of homemade cider she had hidden since before the occupation. She poured small measures into tin cups, and the soldiers accepted with grateful smiles. "À l'amitié," she toasted. "To friendship." The soldiers raised their cups, echoing in awkward French. "Ah, l'amitié." The mispronunciation drew hearty laughter, and the drink warmed both throat and heart. As the evening deepened, stories began to flow. A young soldier pulled from his pocket a creased photograph of a girl with curled hair. "My wife," he explained slowly, tapping the picture. The villagers nodded, murmuring "femme," and smiled knowingly. Jacques, watching the exchange, felt something stir in him. He stood, leaning on his cane, and began to speak softly. "I have taught children here for 50 years. I have seen their first steps into learning, their dreams for the future. But when the bombs fell, I feared all I had taught them would be buried with these stones." His voice trembled, but his eyes shone with determination. "Now, seeing you work beside us, I believe those dreams may yet live." Captain Miller, seated nearby, listened intently. He had remained quiet, his posture heavy with command, but now he spoke in a low voice, translated by Sister Claire. "I enlisted not for glory. My father fought in the Great War and never came home. I told myself if another war came, I would not stand aside. I would finish what he began." His words carried weight, the kind that comes from wounds invisible to the eye. The villagers absorbed his confession with solemn respect. For the first time, Miller seemed less a commander and more a son carrying his father's shadow. Jacques inclined his head. "Then perhaps your father guides your hand even now, through us." Romano, never one to linger in silence, clapped his hands together. "In my family we talk with food, not speeches," he said with a grin. "My mother cooks pasta, and nobody leaves the table angry." His words, though light, carried truth. The villagers chuckled, and for a moment, war felt distant. The children begged for stories, and soon the soldiers obliged. One described tall buildings in New York that touched the sky. Another spoke of wide fields in Kansas, where wheat swayed like a golden sea. The villagers, in turn, told of summer festivals where lanterns floated on the river, and winters when the chapel bells had rung through snow. As the night wore on, the half-built chapel echoed with voices that spanned languages, ages, and worlds apart. The walls, though incomplete, held the sound like an embrace. Jacques looked around, his heart swelling. The war had stripped them of so much, yet here in the glow of candlelight something vital had returned, humanity shared without fear. When the candles burned low, Jacques whispered to himself, "This is what it means to rebuild. Not only stone, but soul." His words lingered in the quiet, carried on the breath of every flickering flame. The chapel's skeleton grew taller with each passing week, and the sound of hammers and saws was no longer only the work of men and soldiers. Women began to step forward, carrying baskets of food for the workers, their presence weaving warmth into the effort. The smell of fresh bread, thin but still fragrant, mixed with the scent of mortar and dust. Children too joined in, their laughter brightening the labor that weighed so heavily on tired shoulders. One morning, Madame Lefebvre appeared with her sleeves rolled up, holding a basket of apples she had carefully preserved. She placed it on a makeshift table and declared, "If you are to build our chapel, you will not do it on empty stomachs." Her voice, stern as ever, softened when she handed the first apple to a soldier who bowed his head in thanks. The gesture set a precedent. Other women followed, bringing soup, loaves of bread, jars of preserved vegetables. Soon mealtimes became small celebrations, shared around the square. Soldiers offered canned rations in return, and the exchange bound the two groups tighter than any words could. Children scurried about the site, carrying small stones in their arms or passing nails from one worker to another. Their enthusiasm turned chores into play. A boy shouted proudly, "I am building the wall." Though the stone he carried was no larger than his fist, Romano knelt, ruffling the child's hair. "Every stone counts, little man. You're stronger than me." The boy beamed, his chest swelling with pride. Jacques watched these moments with quiet joy. The war had aged him beyond measure, but seeing the next generation laughing among ruins filled him with strength he thought long lost. He leaned on his cane and whispered, "Perhaps hope is not taught, it is lived." Yet, not all welcomed this newfound unity. Henri Duval returned to the square, his face drawn tight with disapproval. "You risk too much," he warned, his voice carrying over the noise of construction. "The more you involve women and children, the more you make targets of us all." Madame Lefebvre, her hands on her hips, shot back without hesitation. "And what would you have us do, Henri? Sit in silence while life crumbles around us? Fear does not build walls, but hands do." Her defiance drew murmurs of agreement. Even those who had once hesitated began to see the chapel not as a gamble but as a necessity. The women's courage, visible and unwavering, shifted the balance. Sister Claire stepped forward, addressing Duval with calm authority. "Do you not see? It is not only stone being rebuilt, it is dignity. If the enemy punishes us for having courage, then at least we will face them standing tall." Duval faltered, his arguments thinning against the tide of determination that had swept through the crowd. He retreated with a bitter shake of his head, leaving behind villagers who no longer looked to him for guidance. As evening fell, the square filled with music for the first time in years. One of the soldiers produced a harmonica, its notes rising gently into the twilight. A girl began to hum a hymn once sung in the chapel, and soon voices joined, French and American alike, weaving melody across broken stones. The children clapped, their voices shrill and sweet, carrying the tune higher than the chapel's ruined tower. Jacques closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. It was not the chapel's bell, but it was proof that the village's heart had not been silenced. He whispered almost to himself, "The stones rise because we rise." In that moment he knew this effort was no longer just about walls and beams. It was about reclaiming life itself, one hand, one voice, one act of defiance at a time. The summer waned, and with each sunrise the chapel grew closer to standing whole again. Its walls, though rough and patched with mismatched stones, rose proud against the horizon. Timber beams framed the roof, and sunlight filtered through the open spaces where stained glass once shimmered. The villagers began to walk past with a reverence they had not felt in years, pausing to touch the stones as if to assure themselves it was real. Jacques Moreau walked slowly through the half-restored nave, his cane tapping against the ground. His heart swelled as he whispered, "You are alive again." He remembered the countless times he had walked here as a teacher, guiding children to their first communions, watching their eyes widen at the mysteries of faith. Now those memories no longer felt like ashes. They had form once more anchored in the rising walls. One evening the villagers gathered in the square, gazing at the progress. Madame Lefebvre spoke with tears glinting in her eyes. "I never thought I would see it again. To think that our children will hear prayers inside these walls, it is more than I dared hope." The soldiers, too, seemed moved by what they had helped create. Romano patted the stone with pride. "Back home I fix cars, never thought I'd build a church. Maybe when the war's done I'll open a shop with my own two hands." His voice carried both humor and longing, and the villagers chuckled softly. their affection for him now unmistakable. Yet a problem remained. The tower, once the chapel's crown, stood bare. Without its bell, the building felt incomplete, like a body without a voice. Jacques lingered there often, staring at the empty frame, his heart aching. "Without the bell," he confided to Sister Claire, "it is only walls. The sound must return, or our spirit will remain mute." The Americans took notice of his quiet longing. One evening, Captain Miller called his men together. "We don't have a bell lying around," he said plainly, "but maybe we can make one." Confused looks followed until Romano clapped his hands. "Metal, sir. We got scrap. Shell casings, broken gear. If we melt it down." His words trailed, but hope had already sparked. The next days brought a flurry of work. Soldiers collected discarded parts, dented canteens, twisted shrapnel. Villagers added old pots and broken tools. Piece by piece they built a pile of sacrifice, objects once meant for war or survival, now destined to become a voice of faith. When the makeshift forge was lit, the glow painted their faces in red and gold. Sweat poured as the men hammered, shaped and refined. Children peeked from the edges, whispering in awe. To them it was as if they were watching alchemy, war's metal being transformed into a promise of peace. Jacques, too frail to labor at the forge, sat nearby, his eyes glistening as sparks leapt into the night. "Do you see?" he whispered to Claire. "Even the weapons of destruction bow to life. Even they can be turned into something holy." At last the rough bell took shape, imperfect, scarred with marks of its origin, yet beautiful in its defiance. When lifted onto a frame, its dull surface caught the morning sun, gleaming like a beacon. The villagers gathered around, hushed with reverence. Romano struck it gently with a hammer. The sound rang out, deep and uneven, yet it carried across the valley. Elders closed their eyes, tears streaming as the echo rolled over the fields. For the first time since the bombs fell, the village heard its chapel's voice again. Jacques clutched his cane, overwhelmed. "It is not the same bell," he murmured, "but perhaps it is better. It is ours, born of our suffering, our courage, our unity." His voice broke, but his spirit soared. The day of consecration drew near, and the people of Saint-Pierre knew they were no longer simply rebuilding a building. They were preparing to reclaim their soul. The morning of consecration arrived with a sky washed clear by rain, the air cool and fresh, as if the heavens themselves had been renewed. Villagers dressed in their best, patched coats, faded dresses, and carefully mended shoes, filing toward the chapel with reverence. The soldiers, though in uniform, walked with equal solemnity, their helmets tucked under their arms as a sign of respect. The chapel, though simple, stood whole. Its patched walls bore the scars of war, but within them burned the triumph of unity. The rough bell in the tower hung ready, its bronze-like surface glinting as the first rays of sunlight struck it. Children skipped ahead, their laughter mingling with the quiet murmur of prayers, while the elders walked slowly, leaning on canes and on each other. Inside, candles flickered along the altar, casting gentle light upon faces marked by years of hardship. Sister Claire, her habit pressed and clean, led the gathering in prayer. Her voice was steady, rising with a strength that belied her frail frame. "This house, once broken, stands again because hands refuse to surrender. May it remind us that faith, like stone, endures when it is carried together." The villagers bowed their heads, tears glistening in their eyes. Madame Lefebvre clutched her rosary so tightly her knuckles whitened. Beside her, young children tried to mimic their elders, folding their hands in prayer, their eyes wide with wonder at the rebirth of a place they barely remembered. Jacques Moreau stood near the front, leaning heavily on his cane, his heart pounding with both joy and disbelief. As the hymn began, he closed his eyes, and for a moment it was as if all the years of silence had vanished. He heard not just voices, but the echo of generations before him, his parents, his students, his late wife, all woven into the song. His chest ached, but it was the ache of fulfillment. Romano, standing at the side with other soldiers, struggled to understand the French words of the hymn, but the melody spoke louder than language. He whispered to Miller, "Never thought I'd be in church in France, singing along to something I don't even know. But it feels right, doesn't it?" Miller nodded, his gaze fixed on the villagers kneeling in prayer. "Feels like more than a church. Feels like a victory the war can't touch." When the prayers ended, Jacques rose slowly, his voice trembling yet resolute as he addressed the gathering. "We have seen hunger, fear, and destruction. We have buried too many dreams. But today we have raised more than stone. We have raised hope, and hope once awakened will not fall again." As his words faded, Sister Claire signaled to Romano, who stood near the bell rope. With a nod, he pulled hard. The new bell rang out, deep and uneven, yet its sound carried across the valley like a cry of defiance. Elders wept openly, clutching one another as the vibration echoed through their bones. Children covered their ears, then laughed, their shrill voices mixing with the bell's call. The sound reached beyond the chapel, over the fields and into the forest, where it scattered birds into the sky. For the villagers, it was not just noise, it was resurrection, the return of a voice silenced by war and now reborn through unity. Tears streamed down Jacques' cheeks as he whispered, "The bell sings again. We are whole." He sank onto a bench, exhausted yet elated, his spirit soaring higher than his body could endure. The villagers lingered long after the mass ended, unwilling to let the moment fade. They touched the walls, shared embraces, and sang until their voices grew hoarse. Soldiers stood among them, smiling quietly, as though they too had been given something precious beyond measure. For that day the war seemed far away. Within those walls, patched and imperfect, Saint-Pierre had reclaimed not just its chapel, but its soul. The days after the consecration passed with a quiet sweetness. The chapel, once a ruin of sorrow, now stood as a symbol of defiance and unity. Its patched walls glowed in the morning sun, its uneven bell tolled at dusk, and its doors, though simple, welcomed all who entered. For the villagers of Saint-Pierre, life would never return to what it had been, but something deeper had been restored. Their dignity, their belonging, their soul. The Americans lingered only a little longer. Orders came, calling them forward to new battles. The soldiers packed their gear, their laughter tinged with a weight they did not speak aloud. The villagers watched silently, a mixture of gratitude and dread pressing on their hearts. Gratitude for what had been given, dread for the uncertainty that would return when the uniforms marched away. On the final evening, the square filled once more. Villagers brought bread, cider, and what little cheese they had, laying it out in a humble feast. "For our friends," Madame Lefebvre declared, her stern voice breaking with warmth. The soldiers accepted with shy smiles, raising their cups in unison. "To Saint-Pierre," Romano said, his accent thick but his meaning clear. The villagers answered as one, "À Saint-Pierre." Jacques sat at the edge of the gathering, his cane resting against his knee, his heart swelling as he watched strangers and villagers share food, stories, and laughter, as though they had always been one people. He leaned toward Sister Claire and whispered, "When they came, we feared another army. But they leave as brothers." Later, as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Captain Miller approached Jacques. His voice was low, weighted with sincerity. "We'll be gone tomorrow, but what you've built here, it will last. Longer than this war. Longer than us." Jacques looked at the younger man, seeing not just a soldier but a son burdened with responsibility beyond his years. "You gave us more than safety, Captain. You gave us back ourselves. For that we cannot repay you." Miller shook his head. "It wasn't just us. You all chose to stand, to believe again. That's what rebuilt this chapel." Romano joined them, his grin soft but proud. "And don't forget I carried half those stones myself." Jacques chuckled, his laughter breaking through the heaviness of farewell. "Yes, Romano, and one day when you are old you will tell your grandchildren you built a chapel in Normandy." When dawn came, the soldiers marched out of Saint-Pierre. The villagers gathered by the roadside, waving with tears in their eyes. Children ran alongside the column for as long as their legs would carry them, shouting, "Merci, merci," until the dust swallowed the men from view. The chapel bell rang that morning, its rough voice echoing across the valley as if blessing the soldiers on their journey. Elders wept openly, hands clasped in prayer. Jacques stood before the door, his cane firm in the soil, his gaze lifted toward the tower. "You sing for them," he murmured, "for those who gave us back our voice." The seasons would change, the war would rage on, and hardships would return. Yet the villagers knew the chapel was more than stone. It was their anchor. And with each toll of the bell, they remembered not only their past, but also the strangers who had come with rifles and left having built a home for the spirit. As evening fell, Jacques wrote his final words in his notebook. "They rebuilt more than walls. They rebuilt our hearts. The echo of their kindness will ring as long as the bell itself." If this story moved you, remember to subscribe to the channel for more tales of resilience and hope. And don't forget to click on the video, suggested here on the screen. another journey of courage awaits you.